Vahe, how much heat have you been taking since you released your column?
Yeah, I think I don't know how to put it on the meter, but I'd say it's exponential compared to a number of things that I've had come at me in the past. And I certainly expected blowback, understand the dissent, understand the anger. Um, but it has been a lot, and I think I'm trying to think of it as in the spirit of it adding to the dialogue in the end. I mean, that's how I'm trying to process it. That I think, if nothing else, no matter how much it's upset people, I do think if they actually read the column instead of just the headline, they would come through it with at least an appreciation of the dilemma the voters are up against in how it's currently structured.
What's the dilemma in your mind?
Yeah, it's good, and I'm glad you're giving me a chance to sort of say the whole thing out loud because it probably merits that. The way there's two phases of the voting basically, or two branches. One is the modern players. That's a whole separate category, and all those are their own debates, of course. What the structure has come to be with the coaches, a contributor, and senior players is that there are a total of five of those under one umbrella of voting. So, in other words, three senior candidates, a coach, and a contributor. And out of those five, they're all lumped together into one vote. You can pick three. So, as I noted, I think up high in the column, if it were a simple yes, no, up, down vote on Bill Belichick, I absolutely would have voted for him. But that's not exactly how it works. Obviously, I understand people saying he's the most qualified of the group. I do think he's the most qualified of the group. But what I found, I'm rambling more than you were ready for,
No,
but
no. Take
what
your
I found
time.
as I went along in the process was that I felt obligated to enter it with an open mind. And as it simmered down to what those three picks should be, I found myself thinking a lot about last chances for guys who are never going to get in the Hall of Fame if they don't get in now. What happens with the senior pool is voters kind of jokingly call it the abyss, but once you're in the senior pool, you're in there with dozens of people backed up over the years. We could go on and on about how that's come to be, but part of it is that the Pro Football Hall of Fame didn't start till 1963. So there's a whole bunch of dynamics there. But once you're in that abyss, you only kind of come back out when a senior committee that year makes you their nominees. And then if you don't get the full board approval, then pretty much you go back into that and you're probably not going to get another chance, at least not anytime soon.
So, my question is, as it relates to the senior candidates, take Ken Anderson. In my view, not a Hall of Famer. Roger Craig, not a Hall of Famer. L.C. Greenwood, not a Hall of Famer. And so part of my deal is I think you guys, and respectfully, are like, hey, we got to get as many people in as possible. And me, someone on the outside, is like, you got to get as many deserving people in as possible, and you got to keep as many undeserving people out. And like, there should be like hard lines because if everybody gets in, it's not a Hall of Fame anymore.
I totally agree with you on that point. And one of the reasons it's come to this structure, I think, is a reflection of that thinking. I think the thinking is, well, we don't want to dilute the meaning of this. And if I did not think those guys had really strong and important Hall of Fame cases, I wouldn't have just said, oh, we're going to rubber stamp the seniors. Um, I find myself thinking about how the NFL was made and this generation of players. You're a little younger than me still somehow, Jason, but these are a lot of the men I grew up watching that became synonymous with why I love the NFL. They were generational type players. I definitely think the merits of each is an open question, and I think that's sort of the fun in sports. But to me, I think I wrote this in the column, like Roger Craig, when I got on the Hall of Fame committee about 5 years ago, I'm like, Roger Craig's not in the Hall of Fame? I mean, he was, I think, a transformative player on one of the best teams of a 10 or 15 year period. I think he, in a lot of ways, set the tone for the modern running back. L.C. Greenwood, all decade on one of the best defenses ever. Ken Anderson, four-time NFL passing leader. My little snapshots here probably don't adequately convey what happens in that meeting. And we're not really supposed to talk about how the meeting
Yeah.
goes, but the dynamics are, I think, open. And we spent about 3.5 hours talking through these five people. I think it was about 3.5 hours, and that's a 5-minute presentation by people who are very informed and passionate, and a lot of comparison points with people who are in the Hall of Fame, all these kinds of things. I will say though, I don't dispute anybody seeing it differently. I can only speak to how I see it. It's a Rorschach test a lot on how these things go, and everybody has different values. But I guess I do want to assure you and the public, however it should be phrased, that I think if you sat in these meetings, you would be impressed by the rigor and robust nature of the conversation. I actually think you'd really enjoy it, Jason. I think you'd be a good voice in there.
Yeah, and I think that's why I'm not in there. Here, because one of the things I would object to, and this I think this happened long before you, Vahe. They came up with this story or justification of, can you tell the story of the NFL without this person? And from the very first time I heard it, I was like, no, that's not the standard. No, I completely disagree with that. That's a narrative story. That's a storytelling story, and journalists love narratives and blah blah blah, and I get it. But this is about just merit and excellence, and like, holy cow, this was one of the greatest, unbelievable players of all time. It's not about hey, the Hogs were a big deal, and we need someone from the Hogs because they were popular, and so Russ Grimm gets in, and I'm someone that thinks Russ Grimm has no business in the Hall of Fame, and I love offensive linemen, but that's a narrative deal. And so now I want to push back in a way that I think journalists will understand, and I know you can understand this, Vahe. Back when your job was to write great feature stories, the sign of a great feature story would be when Vahe would go, man, look at all these great stories in my notebook that I couldn't squeeze into this story. It's the stuff that's actually on the cutting room floor that's the proof that the stuff that actually made it in is great. And a lot of times you would do a great story and you'd be like, man, all these stories I couldn't get in, I could do a second story nearly as good as the first story. And that's what we've lost sight of with the Hall of Fame. The cutting room floor is the proof that the people in the Hall of Fame are actually as great as we're saying they are. I wish people would understand that rather than trying to tell the full comprehensive story of the NFL, and I need this guy. You can never tell the full comprehensive story in any story. You've only got so much space. And, to me, the Bible did it, but trust me, there's a bunch of other stories that got left out of the Bible. But it's a great... would you respond to that?
First of all, I love the analogy because I think it's a worthy parallel track to how we should look at it, and I do think some of our discussion boils down to Jason Whitlock sees Ken Anderson and says no way. I see Ken Anderson, and I say he's part of the link in the chain and was important in his time. I absolutely respect your argument, and I stand by mine, but I think it's a really interesting line of thought to keep applying to this. And I do want to credit the Hall of Fame for constantly trying, at least, to have these systems evolve. Find ways. Like, for instance, one of the reasons we're having this furor over Belichick is that the Hall of Fame recently changed the time period between a coach being out of the league and when he's eligible. That has been a little fluid over the years. And a friend of mine told me this. It's sort of apropos of nothing, but I find it interesting as I think about how much we should think this is a players' hall, that, we have to think about, we're thinking about the coaches and contributors. But I guess the last coach to go in on the first ballot was Don Shula. Only six coaches have, and that was in '97. You know what coaches didn't? Vince Lombardi, Bill Walsh, and Paul Brown. Now, in a way, it's apples and oranges, but it speaks a little bit to the changing tenor of how the times have evolved, but also how the Hall of Fame's guidance and rules have changed too.
So I think it was Mike Chappell in Indianapolis, longtime NFL guy, very well respected guy. He's come out and said that he didn't vote for Belichick, and he framed it as I voted for Robert Kraft. And I think that's also part of the problem is that the way the system is, Robert Kraft and Bill Belichick were in competition with each other, and that makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
Because, go ahead.
No, that's all. It speaks to the same point that I think I feel about the whole five, right? I mean, but that is a pretty significant snapshot of it, right? In a sense, you've got Belichick up against Kraft, and I mean,
Should never happen.
there I think was a perception there might be, a block of voting that would say it's automatically Belichick and Kraft, and then figure out one of the seniors. We can't get into the minds of anybody. That's one of the reasons I figured I should try to write this. I saw a lot of stuff being said about, the way some of the pieces were written was that, oh, it had to be that, Spygate and Deflategate were what people were thinking of, or that I saw people assuming like that, well, since Belichick was kind of gruff with the media, that, media, I, I just can't believe people would be that petty on that aspect of it, the idea of how he would be with the media. But I can't speak for anybody on how they looked at what those other things meant in the game. The way the Hall of Fame discussions work, we're basically told you're limited to things that happen on the field, and those things are aspects of on the field, right? I mean, they are part of how anybody might look at him.